Jojalapa, Tashidele, Lasso, Fiafulla. Namaste everybody. Welcome back to our channel, Jhigu Economy. If you're new here, this is the channel where we take terrifyingly dense government economic data and translate it into plain, everyday human language. In our last video, we broke down how Nepal Rashtra Bank steers our cash, but we ended on a massive cliffhanger, the currency peg with India. Why do we do it? Well, to understand that, you have to imagine a world with no rules. Imagine waking up in Nepal tomorrow morning. You check your phone and it says $1 equals 300 Nepali rupees. You pause, you refresh, you convince yourself it's just a technical glitch. The next day, you look again. $1 equals 200 Nepali rupees. Now it feels less like a glitch and a lot more like reality is improvising without the script. Suddenly, your salary is completely unstable. From one week to the next, your purchasing power is either a lucky jackpot or a total financial disaster. No warning, no explanation, no consultation, just pure currency roulette. This is exactly what happens when small, developing economies let their currency float entirely free without the massive financial debt required to absorb global macroeconomic shocks. So, decades ago, Nepal made a radically different choice. Not the structural chaos of a fully open currency system, but not the illusion of complete monetary independence either. Instead, we chose structural alignment. We anchored ourselves directly to a much larger, sturdier system, the Indian Rupee. In simple terms, we decided not to brave the open financial seas alone. We tied our boat to a much bigger vessel. And from that single foundation decision flows absolutely everything else in our modern financial lives: stability, predictability, and also deep structural dependence. Because in macroeconomics, long term survival is rarely about absolute freedom. It is almost always about structure. And as we are about to see, plugging your boat into massive ship means that whatever happens to their engine room happens directly to you too. Structure always comes with a price. To fully understand that price, we have to look past the abstract numbers and see the daily mechanics of how this tie actually operates on the ground. It all traces back to a very specific, rigid mathematical ratio that dictates the pulse of our entire marketplace. The secret relationship between 100 Indian rupees and 160 Nepali rupees, or more precisely, the 1.6 rule that quietly holds the entire Nepali economy together. A currency peg simply means this: the Nepal Rashtra Bank explicitly commits to maintaining a fixed exchange rate with the Indian rupee. In practice, our central bank stands ready to buy and sell massive volumes of foreign currency daily to guarantee that the rate never moves from roughly 1.6 Nepali rupees for every 1 Indian rupee. But here's the part that most people completely miss: Nepal is not an odd anomaly. According to data from the International Monetary Fund, around 40 economies worldwide operate under some version of a fixed exchange rate peg. And these aren't all small or isolated systems. Bhutan anchors directly to the Indian rupee. In southern Africa, nations like Lesotho, Namibia, and Eswatini hook their domestic currencies to South Africa's rand. Across West and Central Africa, entire regional monetary unions operate on currencies permanently linked to the euros. And in the Middle East, financially heavyweights like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar and Jordan maintain strict multi decade pegs to the US dollar. So, Nepal's peg is not a political exception. It's a highly vetted, globally utilized macroeconomic strategy. But here's where Nepal's case becomes uniquely high stakes. It's not about the fact that currency pegs exist elsewhere, it's about the staggering scale of what we are pegged to. Roughly two-thirds of Nepal's entire trade happens with India. Our fuel, our essential medicines, our daily food supply chains, and even a large share of our tourism inflows are deeply, inseparably integrated with the Indian economy. The peg isn't just an abstract financial choice, it's a direct reflection of real world physical dependence. Think of it like this: Nepal is a climber securely tied to a powerful mountain guide. We do not choose every single step independently, but we gain something absolutely vital in return: stability on a difficult, unpredictable path. Where the guide moves, the climber must adjust. Not because the climber has no strength of its own, but because the rope defines the entire system they both are operating in. So don't think of the peg as an isolated central bank reflective. It's a stability engineering. The real world question is, does this particular rope still fit the complex economic terrain we're climbing today? To answer that, we have to look at how the rope was woven. This modern stability wasn't built overnight in a sterile boardroom. To fully grasp why we are locked into this relationship, we have to travel back to the unmitigated chaos that forced our state to build this anchor in the first place. The wild history of how Nepal got its currency system. Because before we can productively debate whether it still serves us today, we have to understand how it even began. To understand why Nepal eventually tied its financial fate so closely to that of India, we have to go back to an era where the system was, well, not really a system at all. Think financial Wild West. No central monetary authority, no unified exchange rate, just markets, money, and utter volatility. Before the establishment of the Nepal Rashtra Bank in 1956, Nepal did not possess a dominant single national currency system. Indian rupees and various local Nepali coins circulated completely side by side in the markets. But in daily practice, the Indian rupee heavily dominated all major transactions. And the exchange rate? It wasn't decided by a government policy, nor was it regulated by law. It was dictated entirely by a powerful community of local money changers known as the sharafs. These sharafs were the ultimate market intermediaries. They gathered in the marketplaces and set daily exchange rates based entirely on immediate demand, localized supply, and their own immense market influence. No electronic spreadsheets, no formal monetary committee, just price discovery happening in real time. The result was a system that worked for trading, until it didn't. Because market driven in this context often meant highly unstable, wildly uneven, and completely impossible for the state to control. So, the state stepped in to end the volatility. On April 13, 1960, Nepal formally overrode the old setup. The government's new directive was incredibly bold. The state would fully guarantee that it would buy or sell any volume of Indian currency at a fixed official rate. In one single move, they wiped out chaos driven prices and created a single predictable reference rate for the entire economy. But this wasn't the exact version we use today. Between 1960 and 1993, this fixed relationship evolved. In total, the central bank recalibrated and adjusted the peg 9 times over those 3 decades, slowly tightening the screws and refining the mechanism to react to regional shocks. And then comes the final permanent lock. On February 1, 1993, the last adjustment was made. The rate was vaulted down at 100 Indian rupees to 160 Nepali rupees. And then it completely stopped moving. That number didn't just become an official central bank policy, it became the ultimate psychological anchor of our macroeconomy, a reference point that has now defined the Nepal's entire financial system for over 3 decades. So, when people ask whether Nepal's exchange rate system is old, the honest answer is yes, it absolutely is. But it is also the direct product of a long historical journey away from market chaos, through state intervention, and into stability engineering. And whether that historical solution still fits a modern economy, that is the critical debate we are only now starting to have. But vaulting that rate down didn't just stabilize day to day retail transactions, it created a permanent, open conduit between our two nations. By locking the nominal ratio at 1.6, we didn't just copy their numbers, we transformed a policy choice into a living mechanism, one that leaves us dealing with what economists call the two doors inflation. Here's the ultimate truth about our currency lock. Remember how we said in the beginning that Nepal chose this peg to escape the wild, daily chaos of global currency roulette? It worked. But here's the catch: escaping exchange rate chaos didn't actually eliminate inflation from our lives. It simply split it into two completely different entryways. By pinning the Nepali rupee to Indian rupee at that fixed 1.6 rate, we traded away our independent monetary control for absolute price predictability with our neighbor. But that connection leaves the house completely wide open to the two doors of inflation. Step through the first door: imported inflation. Because Nepal imports over 60% of its entire supply of goods directly from India, a fixed exchange rate means that price movements in Indian wholesale markets transfer cleanly and directly into Nepali retail markets. If the cost of fuel, manufacturing, or cross border logistics rises in India, those exact higher prices cross our borders instantly. The exchange rate didn't fluctuate, but the physical goods did. The Nepal Russia Bank can respond, but not with the same degree of freedom as a fully floating currency system. Large departures from India's monetary conditions can create severe, unsustainable pressure on the peg. Look at a simple everyday reality. Imagine a specific medicine costs 100 Indian rupees in a pharmacy across the border. At the fixed rate, that translates to roughly 160 Nepali rupees in Kathmandu. Now, suppose inflation inside India pushes that exact same medicine up to 120 Indian rupees. The peg itself hasn't moved an inch. It is still strictly 1.6, but the price you pay in Nepal instantly becomes 192 rupees. Inflation arrived in your neighborhood, not because the exchange rate changed, but because the product itself became more expensive at the source. Now, turn your attention to the second door, the US dollar factor. Even though we stabilize our internal relationship with India, we are still completely exposed to global dollar storms through them. When global markets face tension and international investors flock to the safety of the greenback, the US dollar strengthens globally. As a result, the Indian rupee depreciates against the dollar. And because we are locked hand in hand at that 1.6 ratio, the Nepali rupee automatically and helplessly plunges against the dollar right alongside it. Suddenly, anything Nepal buys from the rest of the world, like crude oil, industrial machinery, or third country electronics, becomes drastically more expensive in Nepali rupees, even though Nepal didn't alter its single domestic policy. Now, if this cross border loop sounds confusing, don't worry. Later in this video, we are going to look at the exact daily math behind this and debunk the massive myth about how your bank actually sets the dollar rate in Kathmandu. But for now, notice the immediate trade off. Ultimately, our peg is a protective umbrella, not a fully sealed indoor bunker. It beautifully shields us from the chaotic, day to day downpours of exchange rate volatility with our immediate neighbor. But if the regional economic climate gets hot or a global dollar storm rolls in across the ocean, Nepal cannot escape it. We have to sit under that umbrella and sweat out the heat right alongside India. At this point, you might be wondering if inflation from India can still reach Nepal so easily through these two doors, what exactly is the peg protecting us from? The answer is not inflation, it's uncertainty. Without the peg, Nepal wouldn't just inherit India's prices. We would also have to worry about the value of our currency moving unpredictably against India's every single day. Imagine trying to run a business where your raw materials from across the border change value on the charts every hour. The peg doesn't freeze prices, it freezes one major source of absolute instability. So, if we are fundamentally forced to absorb India's domestic inflation and copy their global currency movements, how does our own central bank maintain any semblance of control inside our borders? To keep from being completely swept away, Nepal has to quietly, deliberately bend one of the strictest, most unyielding laws in modern economic theory. There's a rule in economic theory that sounds almost illegal, and in a structural way, it kind of is. It's called the impossible trinity. As economists like to say, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And the impossible trinity is basically the rigid menu that tells you exactly what you can never order at the same time. The law states that it is mathematically impossible for a country to simultaneously maintain a fixed exchange rate, allow completely free movement of capital across its borders, and run an independent domestic monetary policy. You only get to choose two vertices on that triangle. The third one has to be sacrificed. Now, on paper, this sounds like a permanent constraint, but Nepal pulls off an incredible trick. It quietly bends a textbook rule. How? Because Nepal does not allow the free, unhindered movement of capital. We operate under strict, sweeping capital controls. For the average citizen, it is not legally simple or permissible to invest money freely abroad, move massive wealth out of the country, or directly plug into global financial markets. So, what does that restriction change? It completely alters the underlying math. When capital is blocked from moving freely, the strict version of the impossible trinity starts to soften. This legal barrier is what grants Nepal something absolutely valuable: a small pocket of monetary policy breathing space. It means that our central bank still retains some real power to independently adjust local interest rates, manage banking liquidity, and respond directly to our own unique domestic conditions. But here's the critical macroeconomic insight: this breathing space is not unlimited freedom. It is highly contained, tightly monitored flexibility operating inside a much larger constrained system. So, yes, Nepal successfully bends the classic textbook rule, but it doesn't break it. It manages it. And that incredibly delicate management is exactly what keeps our daily financial architecture from collapsing. But economic theory always collides with physical reality. A legal shield built on paperwork is only as tight as the physical borders that enclose the nation. And that brings us to the ultimate point of friction: the massive, real world gap between what is written in our laws and what actually happens on the ground. Why does Nepal's financial system always feel like it's walking on a tightrope? Because it is. Just not the kind of rope you would expect. On paper, Nepal enforces strict capital controls, meaning money cannot legally flash flood out of our banking system into foreign assets. But in the real world, Nepal shares one of the most open, porous economic borders on the planet with India. The physical border is open, completely open, which means goods, people, and currency will always discover an informal pathway. So, if interest rates or liquidity conditions in India and Nepal diverge too far from each other, a reaction is triggered. Capital starts to quietly, invisibly move across the border through deep seated trade networks, informal channels, and parallel catch systems like Hundi. It doesn't happen officially on bank ledgers, but it happens highly effectively in reality. And this matters immensely because if too much capital informally leaks out of our economy, Nepal's vital foreign exchange reserves gets depleted, putting intense, direct pressure on the absolute bedrock of our entire monetary existence, the peg itself. Nepal is locked in a perpetual balancing act between two powerful opposing forces: strict legal restrictions on paper and real world economic leakage across an open geography. Think of it this way: Nepal is tied to India's massive economic engine by a rope. But that rope is not infinitely elastic. It stretches, it tightens, and when the tension builds too high, it pulls back with immense force. This is precisely why our true monetary independence is vastly narrower than it appears in official central bank circulars. Even a tiny difference in local policy can trigger massive, unintended real world market reactions. And here's the truly uncomfortable reality: this entire system carries steep, structural, long term costs. High domestic inflation can make Nepali goods less competitive internationally. Plus, structural dependence on one dominant trade partner completely reduces our incentives to diversify. Over time, the economy quietly adjusts itself around constraints rather than opportunities. So, what looks like stability can quietly become structure, and what looks like structure can easily become a trap. Nepal isn't just managing a simple exchange rate, it is managing a fragile, high stakes trade off between control, leakage, and systemic dependence. And that balance is becoming tougher to hold every single day. This daily tire walk explains everything about our internal banking policy, but it also creates a massive, widespread illusion across our commercial bank tellers, especially when everyday citizens look at the boards and watch our money fluctuate against the rest of the global financial system. Remember that floating myth we mentioned earlier? Here's where it completely unravels. When you log onto your phone, look at the daily exchange rates, and watch the Nepali rupee fluctuate against the US dollar, it feels like someone right here in Nepal is actively analyzing global markets and deciding that rate every single morning. It feels like there must be a secure boardroom somewhere in Kathmandu where top central bankers gather at dawn, look at a chart, and say, today, the US dollar shall be 134.57 rupees. But that's not how it works. Not even close. Nepal does not directly calculate or set the value of its rupees against the US dollar, the euro, the British pound, or any other global currency. What Nepal actually fixes is one single thing: the Nepali rupee to the Indian rupee. Everything else you see on the board is simply a mathematical consequence. So, when local commercial banks update their daily exchange rate boards, they aren't engaging in deep macroeconomic philosophy. They are quite literally performing a basic multiplication step. They are essentially saying, India's currency moved against the world, so our currency moves along with it. That's the whole script. No hidden mystery, just arithmetic. Picture this global financial handshake. Nepal is holding India's hand. India is holding the global financial system's hand. When the US dollar strengthens across global trading desks, or the euro surges, or the British pound does its usual thing of being incredibly expensive and emotionally confident, India gets pulled by market forces. And because Nepal is locked to India's hand, we get pulled right along with them, automatically, relentlessly, indifferently. This is the exact reason why the Nepali rupee consistently weakens against major global currencies over time, even during periods when Nepal itself didn't change a single domestic policy. People see this constant depreciation on the news and immediately panic, thinking something must be wrong inside Nepal's economy. But that's not necessarily true. Often, what you're looking at is not a domestic failure at all. It's a transmission mechanism. It's an outside global shock passing smoothly through India and arriving directly in Nepal. And here's the core takeaway: this is not a glitch in the matrix. This is precisely how the entire system was designed to function from day one. The peg was built to guarantee absolute price stability against our largest, most critical trading partner. The price of obtaining that localized stability is simple. You must willingly inherit India's movements against the rest of the world. No drama, no grand conspiracy, just structure. It's a system built entirely on history, geography, and unwavering arithmetic. But as our 21st century economic landscape accelerates into an era that is fundamentally more globalized, entirely digital, and vastly more complex, it forces an incredibly complex question onto the table. Is our long-standing safety net starting to turn into a cage? So, let's ask the ultimate, most uncomfortable question. If Nepal's exchange rate system has successfully delivered decades of essential transaction stability, is there a tipping point where that stability transforms into structural rigidity? In other words, what is the actual alternative to the peg? This is no longer just an abstract academic debate whispered in university hallways. It is slowly, but surely entering mainstream national economic and political policy discussion. Recent analytical studies, including the World Bank's Nepal Country Economic Memorandum, have highlighted a critical structural concern. Maintaining this rigid, historic exchange rate dynamic may have inadvertently contributed to our weaker export performance over the past 2 decades. Now, in economics, correlation is not causation, but the data is serious enough that the conversation has formally breached the inner circles of government planning. High level government economic reform commissions have begun recommending that Nepal formally research and prepare alternative exchange rate frameworks for a long term future. And politically, the dialogue is no longer just theoretical either. The Rashtriya Swatantra Party explicitly included a formal commitment in its election manifesto, its Bacha Patra, stating that the party will formally study and evaluate the fixed peg system utilizing top tier international expertise. So, what are the concrete alternatives being weighed by experts? Economists generally point to three broad structural options. First, a managed float, which would allow the Nepali rupee to move more freely based on real market demand, but still give our central bank the right to step in during high volatility. Second, a crawling peg, where the official rate isn't bolted down forever, but is instead adjusted up or down automatically by tiny fractions of time. And third, a currency basket system, which would unlink Nepal from a single neighbor and tie our rupee to a balanced mix of global currencies instead, such as the US dollar, the Indian rupee, and the Chinese yuan. But here's the vital real world reality check. Nepal is under absolutely zero immediate pressure to change the system tomorrow morning. In fact, our current financial architecture is heavily backed by robust foreign exchange reserves, which act like a massive, highly secure macroeconomic shock absorber. So, in the short term, the peg is not fragile. It is actually exceptionally stable and deeply comfortable. But the deeper, generational question still remains. Does a financial anchor designed all the way back in early 1990s still fit a modern economy that is fundamentally more globalized, entirely digital, and vastly more complex? Or, put most simply, is the very policy that gives us stability today also creating silent constraints for our growth tomorrow? In macroeconomics, there are never easy answers, only trade offs between stability, flexibility, and sovereign control. For over 30 years, Nepal has willingly chosen one specific balance. The question we face now is whether that historic balance still matches the dynamic nation we are trying to become. What do you think? Does the 1.6 peg protect our future or does it pin us down? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've been following this series, thank you so much for joining me on this journey. We started by exploring the fundamentals of monetary policy. Then we examined Nepal's exchange rate peg and the trade offs that come with maintaining it. Don't forget to subscribe to Jhigu Economy. Sube for your time, and I'll see you next time. Bye.